Europe in 1914 was already a continent on edge. Long before a single gunshot echoed through Sarajevo, tension had been building beneath the surface quietly, relentlessly like heat trapped inside a sealed chamber. Empires stood tall, but their foundations were cracked. Old borders no longer matched living identities, and millions of people felt ruled by powers that did not represent them. National pride hardened into resentment. Cultural differences became political weapons. And nowhere was this pressure more intense than in the Balkans. This was not a region suddenly consumed by chaos. It was a crossroads of empires, memories, and unfinished struggles. For centuries, Balkan peoples had lived under foreign rule, fighting for language, faith, and self-determination. By the early 20th century, those struggles had not disappeared, they had sharpened. New nations were born, but their dreams extended beyond their borders. Old empires, especially Austria-Hungary, tried to hold together lands filled with competing identities. Each decision, each annexation, each diplomatic move added another spark to an already volatile mix. To the great powers of Europe, the Balkans often seemed distant and unruly, but that distance was an illusion. What happened there pulled in Russia, alarmed Germany, and threatened the fragile balance between alliances. Violence, secret societies, and revolutionary ideas did not emerge overnight. They grew in an environment shaped by fear, pride, and unresolved injustice. By 1914, Europe was not waiting for peace to fail. It was waiting for anything to ignite what had been smoldering for years. In this story, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is not the beginning. It is the match. To understand why that moment mattered so much, we must first understand the tinder. If you are interested in deep, clear storytelling that connects the dots behind world-changing events, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Let us step back into a Europe already trembling on the brink of history's most devastating storm. At the center of Europe's growing unease stood a single decision that quietly reshaped the balance of power in the Balkans. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, a move that appeared administrative on paper but carried enormous emotional and political weight. To Vienna, it was an act of consolidation, a way to secure its southern frontier and reinforce imperial authority. To the people who lived there, and to Serbia watching closely from the east, it felt like a door being slammed shut on long-held hopes. Bosnia-Herzegovina was not empty land. It was home to a complex mix of peoples bound by language, history, and cultural memory, many of whom identified as Slavs. For decades, these populations had lived under shifting rulers, first the Ottoman Empire and then, in practice, Austrian administration. The annexation made this arrangement permanent, turning a temporary occupation into legal ownership. In doing, Austria-Hungary absorbed hundreds of miles of territory populated largely by Slavs, precisely the people who, across the region, were beginning to imagine a future shaped by self-rule rather than imperial decree. For Serbia, the impact was immediate and deeply personal. Still young and newly independent, Serbia had emerged from centuries of foreign domination with a powerful sense of national purpose. Its leaders and intellectuals believed their country was more than a state. It was a promise to all southern Slavs who shared its language and heritage. The annexation struck at the heart of that belief. Bosnia was not just a neighboring province, it was seen as part of a wider Slavic family now locked behind the borders of a rival empire. What made the situation even more painful was geography. Austria-Hungary's expansion cut Serbia off from the Adriatic Sea, denying it a natural outlet to global trade and influence. Serbia's ambitions were no longer merely challenged. They were physically constrained. Across the Balkans, the message was unmistakable. If Austria-Hungary could simply extend its reach and claim territory filled with Slavic communities, then the future of smaller nations was uncertain at best. The annexation fueled anger, but it also hardened resolve. It transformed abstract ideas about nationalism into urgent questions of survival and dignity. Conversations that once centered on culture and identity increasingly turned toward power and resistance. The belief took hold that political goals could no longer be achieved through diplomacy alone, especially when the interests of great empires were involved. The wider European response only deepened the sense of injustice. Russia, traditionally seen as a protector of Slavic peoples, protested but ultimately backed down under international pressure. To many in Serbia and Bosnia, this retreat was a bitter lesson. Sympathy did not guarantee support when confronted by imperial strength. Austria-Hungary, on the other hand, emerged from the crisis emboldened, having faced little lasting consequence for its actions. This imbalance planted a dangerous idea that force, rather than negotiation, was becoming the language of the age. By the time Europe moved closer to 1914, the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina had already done its work. It had sharpened national identities, deepened mistrust, and convinced many that history was no longer moving in their favor. What appeared to be a regional adjustment had instead woven itself into the larger web of rivalries and fears stretching across the continent. The Balkans were no longer merely unstable, they had become symbolic, a place where unresolved ambitions collided with imperial authority. And in that collision, the foundations of peace were quietly eroding, long before the world realized how close it was to the edge. In the shadow of Austria-Hungary's expanding borders, Serbia was moving in the opposite direction, not outward in territory at first, but inward in identity. Having secured its independence in 1878, Serbia entered the 20th century with the confidence and impatience of a young nation that believed its moment had arrived. Freedom, once achieved, did not bring calm. Instead, it awakened powerful questions about purpose, destiny, and unfinished history. To many Serbs, independence was not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a larger mission. That mission was shaped by memory as much as by politics. Centuries of foreign rule had left deep scars, but they had also forged a shared cultural consciousness rooted in language, tradition, and faith. Serbian intellectuals, politicians, and military officers increasingly spoke of a broader Slavic community whose future could not be separated from Serbia's own. The idea of unity among southern Slavs was not presented as conquest, but as restoration, a belief that history had scattered a people who were meant to stand together. This vision, often described as pan-Slavic, carried an emotional force that resonated far beyond government offices and into classrooms, cafes, and army barracks. Yet what inspired hope in Belgrade inspired fear elsewhere. Austria-Hungary, already strained by its multi-ethnic composition, watched Serbia's growing confidence with deep unease. The empire ruled over millions of Slavs whose loyalty was increasingly uncertain, and Serbian rhetoric threatened to turn that uncertainty into open defiance. Every speech about unity, every newspaper article celebrating shared Slavic heritage, felt like a challenge to imperial authority. Serbia did not need to declare war to be seen as dangerous. Its very existence as a confident Slavic state undermined the fragile balance that held Austria-Hungary together. The tension was not limited to words. Serbia's internal politics became closely intertwined with its sense of national destiny. The military gained influence, nationalism shaped public life, and loyalty to the state was often framed in moral terms. To question the national project was to question Serbia itself. This atmosphere produced a society that valued sacrifice, resolve, and action, traits admired at home but misunderstood abroad. Neighboring powers, already accustomed to instability in the Balkans, began to see Serbia not as a small state finding its place, but as a catalyst capable of unsettling the entire region. Russia's presence added another layer of complexity. though distant. Russia was bound to Serbia through cultural ties and shared Slavic identity, and its expressions of support reinforced Serbian confidence. At the same time, this relationship intensified Austria-Hungary's fears, transforming Serbia from a local concern into a potential extension of a much larger rival. In the calculations of Vienna and Berlin, Serbia was no longer acting alone. It was perceived as part of a broader challenge to the existing order in Europe. By the early 1910s, Serbia's ambitions had outgrown its borders, even if its resources had not. The country remained small in population and power, but its ideas traveled far. Victories in the Balkan Wars seemed to confirm what many already believed, that determination and unity could overcome far greater forces. Each success strengthened the conviction that history favored those willing to act decisively. For Austria-Hungary, this was the most troubling development of all. A small nation driven by belief rather than caution was difficult to predict, and even harder to contain. As Europe edged closer to 1914, Serbia stood as both symbol and signal. To its supporters, it represented renewal and justice long denied. To its neighbors, especially Austria-Hungary, it embodied instability and threat. Between these opposing interpretations lay a widening gap of mistrust, one that diplomacy struggled to bridge. In that space, ambition hardened, fears multiplied, and the idea of compromise slowly faded, leaving behind a continent increasingly prepared for confrontation rather than restraint. By the early 20th century, the Balkans had developed a reputation that both reflected reality and concealed its deeper causes. To many outside observers, the region appeared trapped in an endless cycle of unrest, where power changed hands abruptly and loyalty was tested through force rather than debate. Yet this atmosphere did not arise from chaos alone. It grew out of decades of frustration, contested rule, and the belief that history favored those willing to act decisively when institutions failed to deliver justice or representation. Nowhere was this more evident than in Serbia itself. In 1903, the Serbian monarchy came to a sudden and dramatic end when King Alexander and Queen Draga were removed from power by a group of army officers. The event sent shockwaves across Europe, not only because of its brutality, but because it revealed how deeply politics and the military had become entangled in Serbian public life. Authority was no longer seen as sacred or permanent. Instead, it was conditional, dependent on whether leaders were perceived to serve the nation's destiny. For many Serbs, the fall of the royal couple was framed not as disorder, but as correction, a harsh but necessary step in reclaiming national direction. From this environment emerged figures who would shape the region's future in far-reaching ways. Among them was Dragutin Dimitrijević, an army officer whose influence extended far beyond his rank. Known by the nickname Apis, he embodied a new kind of political actor, one who believed that secrecy, discipline, and decisive action mattered more than public approval. Around him formed a network of like-minded individuals, bound by loyalty to an idea rather than a government. This network would later become widely known as the Black Hand. The Black Hand did not see itself as an organization operating outside society, but as its hidden conscience. Its members believed that traditional politics moved too slowly and compromised too easily, especially when confronted by empires like Austria-Hungary. To them, words and treaties were insufficient tools against annexation, repression, and the denial of Slavic self-determination. What they offered instead was a sense of purpose rooted in sacrifice and secrecy, where the individual was secondary to the national cause. This mindset resonated strongly in a region where generations had grown accustomed to living under powers that felt distant and unresponsive. As Serbia's influence expanded after the Balkan Wars, organizations like the Black Hand found new confidence. Military success appeared to validate their worldview, reinforcing the idea that determined action could reshape history. At the same time, the blurred line between state institutions and underground movements made it increasingly difficult to distinguish official policy from private initiative. Many members of these secret networks held positions within the army or government, creating a climate in which authority flowed through informal channels as much as formal ones. To Austria-Hungary and its allies, this development was deeply unsettling. Serbia was no longer just a small nation with ambitious rhetoric. It was a society where nationalist belief, military pride, and clandestine organization overlapped. The empire's leaders feared that such movements could inspire unrest among Slavic populations within their own borders, spreading instability far beyond Serbia itself. Each rumor of conspiracy, each report of secret oaths or training camps, amplified the sense that control was slipping away. Yet within the Balkans, political violence was often understood differently. It was not celebrated openly, but it was normalized as a response to a world perceived as unjust. Many believed that history had been shaped by force long before their generation, and that restraint had rarely been rewarded. This belief did not remain confined to Serbia alone. Similar attitudes could be found across the region, shaped by shared experiences of foreign rule and delayed independence. By the time Europe approached 1914, the Balkans had become a place where ideas carried weight equal to armies, and where loyalty to a cause could override loyalty to a state. Political violence was not an accident of the moment, but the product of years of unresolved tension and hardened expectations. In such an environment, secrecy flourished, trust eroded, and the space for peaceful compromise narrowed. The stage was set not only for confrontation, but for a single act to reverberate far beyond its immediate setting, drawing an entire continent into the consequences of choices made in the shadows. While nationalist ideas and secret movements were reshaping the political mood of the Balkans, events beyond the region were quietly altering the balance of power. The Ottoman Empire, once the dominant force in southeastern Europe, was no longer the immovable presence it had been for centuries. Its authority had been eroding slowly, weakened by internal strain and repeated challenges from both within and outside its borders. What transformed this long decline into a decisive turning point were a series of international crises and wars that exposed how vulnerable the empire had become. The first clear signal came from the West. In 1911, Italy, eager to assert itself as a modern power, launched a war against the Ottomans over North African territory. The conflict was brief and revealing. A European state of relatively modest strength had defeated an empire that once commanded vast regions of the Mediterranean world. For observers across the Balkans, the lesson was unmistakable. If the Ottomans could be pushed aside so easily, then centuries of fear and caution were no longer justified. What had seemed permanent was suddenly fragile, and opportunity replaced hesitation. This realization spread quickly among the Balkan states. Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, each with their own grievances and ambitions, began to see cooperation as a means to accelerate long-held goals. Encouraged by diplomatic support from Russia and emboldened by the Ottomans' visible weakness, they formed the Balkan League and prepared to act. When war broke out in 1912, it unfolded with surprising speed. Ottoman forces were driven from much of Europe, ending a presence that had shaped the region's history for 500 years. The outcome was more than a military victory. It was a psychological transformation. For Serbia, the results were profound. Territorial gains expanded its borders and brought new populations under its control, reinforcing the belief that national ambition, backed by action, could succeed. The victories validated years of nationalist rhetoric and sacrifice, strengthening Serbia's sense of destiny. Confidence grew not only among political leaders, but within society itself. The idea that Serbia was a small state surrounded by overwhelming forces no longer seemed convincing. Instead, it appeared capable of reshaping the map of the Balkans through determination and unity. Yet success carried consequences. The redistribution of conquered territory exposed deep disagreements among former allies, leading almost immediately to renewed conflict. The Second Balkan War erupted when Bulgaria, dissatisfied with its share, turned against Serbia and Greece. Although short-lived, this conflict further elevated Serbia's position. It emerged stronger and more experienced, having navigated both alliance and rivalry in rapid succession. War, it seemed, had rewarded Serbia once again. To neighboring powers, especially Austria-Hungary, these developments were deeply unsettling. Serbia's growth was no longer theoretical. It was visible on the map and felt in regional politics. Each expansion intensified fears that Serbian influence would spill across borders, inspiring Slavic populations within the empire. The fact that these changes had occurred through war rather than diplomacy made them even more alarming. Serbia appeared increasingly confident, perhaps even emboldened by the belief that the international system was unable or unwilling to restrain it. The weakening of the Ottoman Empire thus did more than rearrange territory. It shifted expectations. It taught small states that empires could fall, that borders were not fixed, and that decisive action could bring lasting change. In this new reality, restraint seemed less practical than resolve. By 1913, the Balkans had been transformed from a region of fading imperial control into a landscape shaped by assertive nations and unresolved rivalries. As Europe moved closer to 1914, these wars lingered in memory, their lessons fresh and persuasive. They had raised confidence in some capitals and deepened anxiety in others, tightening the web of suspicion and preparation that stretched across the continent. The Ottoman retreat had created space for new powers to rise, but it had also removed a buffer that once absorbed regional tensions. In its absence, those tensions pressed directly against the interests of the great powers, making the path toward confrontation ever more difficult to avoid. By 1914, the fragile balance holding Europe together rested on a narrow fault line that ran straight through the Balkans. Serbia, strengthened by recent wars and driven by a powerful sense of purpose, now stood at the center of competing ambitions far larger than itself. To the east, Russia had committed itself to Serbia's survival, not only out of strategic interest, but because of shared history, cultural ties, and the belief that protecting Slavic nations was a matter of honor. After earlier setbacks and public humiliations, Russian leaders were determined that there would be no further retreat. Support for Serbia became a line that could not be crossed without consequence. Across the border, Austria-Hungary viewed the situation through a very different lens. The empire was already struggling to maintain unity among its many peoples, and Serbia's rise appeared as a direct threat to that fragile cohesion. Every gain Serbia made, every expression of pan-Slavic solidarity, seemed to echo inside Austria-Hungary's own borders. In Vienna, patience was wearing thin. Containing Serbia was no longer seen as a regional concern, but as a matter of survival for the empire itself. Germany, tied closely to Austria-Hungary through alliance and shared strategic interests, watched these developments with growing concern. German leaders feared that unchecked Serbian expansion, backed by Russia, could permanently shift the balance of power in Eastern Europe. To them, hesitation risked encirclement and decline. Support for Austria-Hungary was not simply loyalty. It was a calculation shaped by fear of losing influence in a rapidly changing world. What made this situation so dangerous was not just the opposing interests, but the certainty on each side that it could not afford to back down. Serbia believed its recent successes proved that history favored decisive action. Russia believed credibility demanded resolve. Austria-Hungary believed restraint would invite internal collapse. Germany believed delay would weaken its position. Each actor interpreted the same events through a different sense of urgency, and each conclusion pushed Europe closer to the edge. By the summer of 1914, the diplomatic system designed to manage such crises had become rigid and unforgiving. Alliances that once promised security now limited flexibility. Mobilization plans left little room for pause or reconsideration. A regional dispute, once containable, now carried the weight of continental consequences. All that was missing was a single event powerful enough to turn tension into action. That moment came in Sarajevo. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not create Europe's divisions, but it exposed them. It forced decisions that leaders had long postponed and transformed calculated risks into irreversible choices. Within weeks, the delicate balance collapsed, and a conflict rooted in Balkan struggles expanded into a war that would reshape the world. Thank you for staying with this story and exploring the forces that pushed Europe toward catastrophe. If you found this analysis valuable and want to continue uncovering the deeper history behind world-changing events, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next chapter.